But I don't think anything is going to go down in history as more important to the people of Staten Island and the future of Staten Island than closing this dump. That day is today. It truly is a great day. No more barges, no more garbage for the people of Staten Island.
The dump closes today, and the people on Staten Island can rest easy knowing that fresh garbage is not going to be brought here again in the future and buried or be added to that mountain of garbage.
People would say it's too big, it's too expensive, there's no alternative, it can't happen. And Guy Molinari would say every day, I'm going to close the garbage dump. And the more people told him he couldn't, the more he was determined that he would.
It was a nightmare. The nightmare is over.
In the back of your mind, and you sort of use it for inspiration, that if little old Staten Island could come together and put the forces in play to end the Freshkills landfill, then we got a shot to win any of these battles that we're up against.
So this month marks a really auspicious occasion, and the great Deputy Borough President Ed Burke has gotten us all together to talk about the fact that 20 years ago this month, the last garbage barge entered Staten Island, and the Freshkills landfill, that monstrosity, was officially closed. And thanks to Ed, we are joined by some of the folks who played a vital role in that momentous occasion. It arguably, and I don't see much of an argument, it has to be the greatest political victory in the history of this borough. And we are really honored tonight, again, to have four of the movers and the shakers. First, it's really wonderful to see Susan Molinari. Susan represented Staten Island in the City Council. You're going to hear that a few times in these introductions. Represented the city, Staten Island in the City Council from 1986 to 1990, and then in the United States House of Representatives from 1990 through 1997. We are also joined by Judge Eric Vitaliano, who is a district court judge in the Eastern District, but back from 1993 to 2001 was in the New York State Assembly representing the Mid-Island. We are joined by Vito Fossella, who also represented Staten Island in the City Council from 1994 to 1997, and then from 1997 to 2009 was our United States House of Representatives. And last but not least, everybody's favorite Staten Islander, Fred Cerullo, who also represented Staten Island in the City Council from 1990 to 1992. And he had the good senses to get out of elective office, but he joined the Giuliani administration and was a commissioner of two different agencies. Each of these individuals was a great representative from this borough. And it really is a thrill to have everybody in the same room. It's good to see all of you. I hope you and your families are well. Susan, I wanted to start with you. And before we get into the discussion about the process that closed Freshkills, I thought it was important for folks who may not have lived it, and for those folks who will see this in the archives at the College of Staten Island 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, for you and Vito and Eric and Fred to share a memory of Freshkills, not as an elected official, just as a Staten Islander, something that can describe it, a particular memory, a description, something that gives our audience a fuller context of the monstrosity that was the Freshkills landfill.
Well, first of all, let me answer that question. I mean, for any one of us, whether you were on the City Council, the Assembly, or Congress, it took up a good 3/4 of your job. Whether it was before they did the barges, the garbage trucks that would come through Staten Island and would leave garbage all over the place, the birds, the garbage that would fly over, the smell that you could smell from 3/4 of Staten Island when there was a good wind, particularly in the summer, the health conditions that you had to deal with by people who lived close to the dump and who had asthma and other breathing problems because of it. medical waste. We had times when we would be called over there to look at medical waste. And I think one of the times where there was the barge, the garbage barge to nowhere that was being picked up, I think, at Nassau County, and no one wanted it. And I went out like the Coast Guard and gave him an injunction so he wouldn't come to Staten Island, just to sort of have that last stand of like, no, we're not gonna be that butt of the joke anymore, and you're not gonna dump your garbage here. But you had to deal with it all the time. But while I have the microphone, if I can just point out that there's someone who's missing from this, who really had probably one of the largest roles to play in shining Freshkills, and that's my dad, who passed away a few years ago, but who spent day and night trying to figure out how to do it. When he said he was going to do it along with other people, you know, we all said like, okay, right, like this is just not going to happen, because it was 4 boroughs against 1, right? And he was able to do it. And I just want to quote in his book, because it's 3/22/2001, he says, "That date described one of the greatest days of my political career, if not the greatest." And so I just kind of wanted to salute my dad in absentia for sort of the work and the inspiration he gave all of us to say, just because people say no, don't listen to them if you're representing your people.
Susan, it's only right that you bring up your dad. We were going to get to the political and the human dynamo that was Guy V. Molinari, but this victory that we'll celebrate, the 20th anniversary this month, this was his victory. And you know, we could cross swords, those of us who did with Guy, but yeah, and I hope that we bring his name up many times tonight, because he put the pieces in place in help getting Rudy Giuliani elected mayor and George Pataki elected governor. And so it's only right that you bring up your dad first. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Borough President.
Judge, give us a memory, some context, so that folks who didn't experience it firsthand can better understand why this is such a sweet victory.
You know, Jim, I think one of the things that happens is that we sort of capture history in snapshots, and we're looking and we're celebrating in this gathering tonight that last shipment of barge garbage to Freshkills. But Freshkills was an odyssey, a nightmare that continued for over 60 years. As when it first opened, there were places around the city of New York where garbage was collected and disposed of, either by incinerator or by landfill. And as all of those closed, the garbage all ended up on our shoreline. But during that odyssey, there was a continuous fight, time and again, to deal with the vectors, with the smell, with the birds. There were athate carts. The roads in the landfill were made of garbage. And every day, the athate carts would ply up and down the hills on the garbage, and the garbage would rot. And we would have victory after victory after victory trying to chisel away at the landfill, whether it was covering the barges with nets, or covered enclosure for unloading, or whether it was eventually getting rid of the athate carts and putting the road network through, to the consent orders that we had fought for year after year with the Department of Environmental Conservation. So it was a constant battle. It just wasn't there and a source of smell and a source of blowing garbage. It was the source of battle, day in and day out, for all the elected officials, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, and it didn't matter whether the mayor was a Democrat or a Republican, or the governor was a Democrat or a Republican. It was a united battle against a nightmare. And today, in this podcast celebration, we're looking at that last event in a nightmare of hard work, and it's nice. You know what I always said that I would be that someday my grandchildren would be able to revert back to what it used to be before it was a dump. It was a park, and say, dump, landfill? What dump? What landfill? And I think we're well on our way to achieving that objective.
Thank you, Judge. We talk about, and we're going to hone in on the specific process, but Judge, to your point about how long of a battle this was, and to Susan's earlier point about her dad, how many times did all of us hear Guy talk about the story of Susan's granddad, about Guy's father, warning in the early days, it was a bad bargain. It wasn't going to be for 2 years or 5 years. Don't do it. And so, to Judge's point, this is a fight that was a long time in the making. Vito, I want to turn to you. I know that you and I have told stories about being sort of young kids and kind of holding our nose, leaving the car at the Staten Island Mall or wherever and running. Tell me about the context of what Freshkills was to you, and give some flavor to folks who might not have lived some of the experiences that you did.
First off, Mr. Borough President, thank you for bringing us together. It's great to see some very old friends, and I really thank you for allowing me to participate in this. So that's number one. Number two is, to me, what stands as a vivid reminder is it smelled like a raging open sewer. Yeah. And to Susan's point, especially on a summer day, if you came over Arden Avenue and you just looked at this mountain of garbage and the stench that would flow, it felt like it was in your clothes. If you were a smoker, you smell the cigarettes in your clothes. It was as if you live with it. Or if you were going through driving along the West Shore Expressway, similarly, you got to a point on the expressway where you said, okay, now the smell is going to be overwhelming and overbearing. And it was just a disaster, right? To Judge Vitaliano's point, it was nothing but an economic disaster, environmental disaster. And you just sort of asked yourself day after day, is this ever going to close? Are we ever going to do anything about it? And there were broken promises after broken promises. When it first opened in 1948, we were only 2% of the city's population. So I think they knew then what the long-term plan was. And I want to just highlight what Susan said too about her dad, Guy. That is, elections have consequences. People in office have consequences. It pays to work together. This was the bipartisan solution, but the city council, the federal lawsuit, the state assembly, the other guy who's not here, a couple of guys, Jim Molinari was a very loyal assistant to Guy Molinari, as well as Senator John Markey, who was instrumental at the state level. But it was the right thing to do. We were fortunate enough to elect the right people at the right time, and together coming, which is what public service should really be all about, right? Doing the right thing for the next generation and the generations to come. So I was, lucky to be there with the support of everybody on this call here. And I do think that it's a testimony, and I would urge people to go back to Judge Vitaliano's point about just not being a snapshot. But to those who said it could never be done, I can probably get you 15 articles of members of the legislative bodies or whoever who never wanted to close, who said it's impossible. We're never going to do it. The city's never going to do it. Well, we did it. And we're all still alive, and we're all still standing. So I think it was a monumental thing. Just very privileged to be a part of it.
I think thinking back to, childhood, because the dump was always there. And actually it was a place where I remember going into the dump as a child because it permitted the public to access the dump back in the day, where you could bring your household garbage, or if you were, doing yard work, you would pile it all in the car and you would go to the dump. And I remember as a kid being inside the dump and not having a clue as to what it really meant. And it was really when Susan was elected and I started to work for Susan that beyond the smell, I mean, I don't think we could stress enough what the memory is all sensory.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in Great Kills on the Great Kills Park side of Great Kills, Highland Boulevard. And there were absolute days that you could smell the dump in Great Kills, and everybody knew. It would be like, oh, there's the dump. It was just like part of our culture. Like there was the smell of the dump. My aunt and my cousins lived near Brookfield, so they were closer to, the Arthur Kill Road side. And there were days where you couldn't be outside. It was that horrific. And so, my memories beyond the sensory is that in those years when Susan was in the council and I was working for her, and then in the years I was in the council, which Jim was 90 to 94, it was about trying to minimize the sort of lack of understanding or respect we were getting from the rest of the city. And so we were in not only a battle for our constituents in dealing with their everyday, my property values I can't sell my house for the money because I live by the dump. The city was closing landfills. I think Judge Vitaliano referenced the closure of landfills. I remember Susan having a resolution when they were closing Edgemere or Fountain Avenue and doing a press conference on that. And then, to make matters worse, while we were calling for the landfill to close, or for other boroughs at least to take their fair share of their waste, the city was then proposing to create a new use at the landfill, and that was to dump the ash that would be coming from incinerators around the city. And so there was this constant battle to just have accountability and responsibility by the rest of the city, and us trying to do our best to provide a better quality of life for our residents. And I drive by on the West Shore and drive by the dump, the old dump, and to just see, I've taken a tour of Freshkills Park, and to see what's happening there is really what we deserve. It's just amazing to think that it actually happened, but it happened together. And look, Staten Islanders are always the strongest when they fight together. And we're always the most effective that way. And this is a great example of how things can really get done, things that people deemed impossible when we're all on the same page.
Fred, I took a term away from you. I said you were from 1990 to 92.
Yes, you took 2 terms away from me. I had many terms in a very short period of time. But yeah,
so
very
Susan,
insightful.
You mentioned your dad's book, and I found it online, and I was struck by a couple of paragraphs. When he talks about Freshkills at one part, he talks about how he got quite annoyed at Lucian Chalfin, who I think was a spokesperson, actually. He was the assistant commissioner for sanitation. Right. And he had suggested the assistant commissioner that Staten Islanders tour the Freshkills landfill to get a better appreciation of it. Yes. The guy talks about it in the book that he had Skip Master write this scathing letter to the New York Times, and then shortly thereafter he calls his senior staff in and says, "Well, we got Pataki here and Giuliani there. It's time to make a serious move on closing this." And it leads to I think Vito alluded to the federal lawsuit. Take us back to those early moments of the serious effort beyond all of us testifying, all of you testifying at consent decrees. Take us to those early moments of we're going to make a concerted effort to figure out how to close this down.
Mr. Roper, I just want to follow up first on something that Fred said. And it wasn't just, although the smells and everything that was, the rats, et cetera, it was also the lack of respect that I think killed Staten Islanders all the time. Not only did we have to take all the garbage from Staten Island, but it was never really a landfill. It was always a dump because it was never, was never under EPA or state regulations in terms of the lining to deal with the leachate. They never appropriately covered the dump with enough dirt so that it wouldn't fly away. When you talk about memories, how many of us remember plastic bags in the trees all over because they just didn't cover it? And the trucks that would be going by, weren't closed appropriately. So it wasn't only that they said, let's dump all of our garbage on Staten Island. It was also, and we're not going to spend a lot of money or time taking care of it as best we can. And so it really was something that we all had to deal with, I think, if we didn't get 10 phone calls a day. So at that point, my dad was, and it says it in the book, and I remember this, he called Peter Powers, who was Rudy's deputy mayor, and said, we're going to go on a lawsuit. We're going to sue the city and the state government. And Pete was like, well, you're going to sue the city. He's like, well, no, not just the city. I'm going to sue the mayor. Pete Powers said, well, Rudy's your friend. Like, you guys have pizza once a week. He's like, and I love him, but this dump has to close, and so we're going to sue. And that was when, they had this serious conversation about, well, what can we really do about this? And then, everybody at the state level did what they needed to do, and Governor Pataki came along. And, look at, you said election have consequences. We never, as Staten Islanders, had the population to allow us to dictate in any way, shape, or form much about politics and government. When it came to that ability of having Pataki and Giuliani and Molinari, let's just put those three out there. I mean, Staten Island put them in office. And so it was at that point that they said, okay, maybe it's time that, we all buckle up and do what we can for the best of Staten Island. And again, to those who weren't there, it's not just a garbage dump, right? It was the world's largest man-made structure. In its day, it was bigger than the Great Wall of China, 2,200 acres, and at some points, 120 feet high. You can imagine what it was like. And so it was just everybody coming together to say, no, you know what? You can't, and you said it, you can say for years and years and generations, there's no way we're going to close this. And so it was open for so many years until everybody all together said, deep breath, we're going to do it.
Jimmy, the other thing that gets lost in the shuffle, before folks may think that this was just a Staten Island only issue, and there was just concerns about what it was doing to our community. What gets lost in the shuffle is that the key piece, and in the bill that I passed in the Assembly, that allowed the bill to pass in the Assembly, is that the bill that closed Freshkills also put the silver dagger in the plan to create 5 huge incinerators, one in each borough. The Brooklyn Navy Yard plan was well underway, and the legislation that the governor signed right at Borough Hall not only put the end date on Freshkills, but it also the end date on the plan for the 5 large incinerators in the city of New York.
Really good point, Judge. Before we get to speak more about that legislation, Vito, I want to go to you and Fred. I want to hear your recollections of those early moments. Did Guy call you in and say, hey, I got an idea about a lawsuit, or tell us what some of those early conversations about we're really making a concerted effort to close this thing at this point?
What I remember most was at that point the Giuliani administration calling me saying, Guy Molinari's going to sue us, and freaking out. Look, I just remember Guy, because Guy called everybody. Then when the battles were the biggest, Guy brought everyone in, and he did then too. And at that point, I was not an elected official. Vito was in the council at that point, so I was already, I guess I was at Consumer Affairs, and I remember talking to Guy about what his plan of action was. And he absolutely believed that it could be done. And he wasn't going to give up until he succeeded. And he did throw the administration, that I recall very well, because I was talking to them as well, and he threw them into a sort of a tailspin about how to deal with this and how to make Guy and how to make Staten Island happy. And then Vito at the council level was working on the local legislation, which I remember very clearly as well, thinking, darn, why didn't I just do that? Susan, how come we didn't just introduce a bill in the council? And so I do remember that. But those were the conversations. It was really strategy, right? It was going to be the threat of a lawsuit. How was it going to happen? The reality is, though, without, the mayor, we think timing is everything. And I think the relationship between Guy and the mayor was, and this is true in so many issues that we had in the 8 years of the Giuliani mayoralty and the Molinari borough leadership, paid dividends for us for the rest of our life that people wouldn't even know, because they're living in a different world in a different time. And they accept what their life is as if that's the way their life would have always been. And so the dump was a focus of everything we did. It was sort of our day advocacy, it was constituent service, but there were also budgetary issues about the dump, motions to delete funding for the dump. And was there ever a year where we didn't fund landfill deodorant? It's almost laughable when we think about what, I have to, please make sure at the top of my priority list is the landfill deodorant. And that's what it was called. And that's so they could spray smell on top of the garbage and hopefully, and then Staten Island is supposed to be grateful for that. And so those are the things that are really clear that completely shifted over time, right? then now you're funding ball fields and bike lanes and plantings, and it's really amazing difference.
Yeah. Vito, you give us some of those early moments of this specific effort to close.
So this was a continuum. When Fred left in '94, I took his place. I asked to be on the Environmental Protection Committee. One goal was, it was important, as we've all said, to have oversight over the landfill because it was such an important issue for everybody. And also to try to develop a sort of a paper trail. I remember the commissioners used to come and testify, or the deputy commissioners, and it was almost like the Bugs Bunny routine of Clancy, take the boys and surround the house. Would I throw a match in the oven if he was in here? And the commissioner at the time, he'd say, well, what's your alternatives? Well, we don't have any. Well, what about exporting garbage? Well, we don't know about it. Well, how you don't know about it? Well, it's too expensive. How do you know it's too expensive? Did you put it was just round and round and round. So you knew there was no plan whatsoever. And as Fred and Susan know, and Eric, the city has to pass a solid waste management plan periodically. And it was clear that there was no resolution, and as a matter of public record, there was no indication that they were going to close it ever. In fact, if my memory serves correct, in that solid waste management plan in February of '96, they projected by about 2017 the landfill would be 500 or 600 feet high, or if not higher. That's how insane it was. But concurrently, Guy was quarterbacking a different strategy with Skipmaster, trying to figure out what the strongest federal case would be. Ultimately, it was under the Clean Air Act for the methane gas emissions and the fact that it violated the city charter because we were accepting all the garbage and nobody else did. And we would sit in his office. John Fusco was there. I think Susan was on the phone from DC, just trying to coordinate that. And that was like in the fall of '95, where it began to crystallize. But, you know, beneath this is, and it needs to be repeated, is I think collectively, even though we helped get Rudy elected, and even though we helped get George Pataki elected, we made that decision to say, we don't care who they are, this is our time to get this thing closed. If this thing doesn't close now, it never will. And then ultimately I introduced, as Fred mentioned in February, you know, almost around the time that the solid waste management plan was being passed and ratified, I introduced a bill that basically said, hey, we're going to close this landfill in 6 years, and that's it. And if you really mean it, then you will sign on to it. And I'll add one last thing about that legislation is, and I was unfortunately a little devious about it. So many people in the council, remember, it was overwhelmingly members of the other party. They so disliked Rudy Giuliani. So I was using that to get them to sponsor or co-sponsor the legislation, to the point of when we got to 26 members, there were 51 members in the city council, I called Guy, I said, hey, we got 26 votes. You know, if this thing comes to the floor, this is gonna pass. So we had a press conference in the hall, in the front entrance of City Hall with John and Guy and me and a few others. And that became, I think, a watershed moment. Meanwhile, Eric and John Markey in the state legislature were pursuing their own course of action. And despite the fact that nobody thought it would occur, from the February to the end of May, we had the agreement in place.
So Susan, if this effort failed, Freshkills would be open still today, right? I mean, the estimates were how long was the remaining capacity? 20 years, 40 years? I mean, Freshkills would still be open today, no?
Sure, I think, there's no doubt about it. Look, and as it progressed, for just 2 years, they announced that they were going to do this. And he said, and it was just going to be temporary to fill in the marshland. And my grandfather, was saying, don't do it. It's never going to close. And so I think he was very prescient, because it probably wouldn't have, because technologically they were able to, as years went by, you thought 125 feet, 2,200 acres, that's as big as they can get. But I remember when I was there, they were coming up with different techniques in terms of, beautiful words that they would have for how they could add more and more garbage and still make that property stable, right? A lot of it was a concern even about the stability of the mountains that they were building. And I mean, God forgive me, but we were talking about wild dogs. I mean, this was something that if you weren't on Staten Island at the time, you just could not appreciate. And with having so little of the ability to politically have other boroughs take control of their garbage, that was something that was never going to happen. We all tried it. Making other, every borough taking care of their own. Politically, that was never going to do it. What did it was the ability to classify waste as interstate commerce and allow some other states who wanted the money to accept our garbage. And that is still the plan as it is today. And hopefully somewhere along the line, someone will be smarter than all of us and come up with a waste reduction program that allows this argument to go away. But they had the technical capabilities to continue to grow this for as long as they needed to.
Well, if you remember the cap, one of the caps was the concern that the mountain in the section near the Arthur River would get so high that it would cause complications for the flight path from Newark Airport.
Planes.
Right, that's what we were actually hoping for, because that's how the Brooklyn dump was closed. When they closed Edgemere or Fountain Avenue, it was Fountain Avenue. It was because the birds.
The Fountain Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue have an interesting history. They were actually closed because it was part of Gateway. So the federal government used to allow Fountain and Pennsylvania Avenue to continue on extension, periodic extension federal statutes, and then I guess the National Park Service said that's it, no more, and that's what led to the closure of Fountain in Pennsylvania.
But I know in Fountain, I think it was Fountain, it was the birds they were getting.
Birds
Well,
in the plane.
there was a problem for Jamaica,
Yeah.
near Kennedy Airport.
Right.
And there was every borough back in the day, which is why I say it was it was an odyssey. It sort of just grew and grew and grew. Every borough did take care of garbage.
Mhm.
At one point. There were landfills. There was one in the Bronx at Pelham. The Housing Authority used to incinerate. There were incinerators in Coney Island at Gansevoort and also in Gowanus. All of those closed. And the only thing that was left was Freshkills.
So I have another question. I thought it would be really interesting if each of you had like a bit of information or something about the whole Freshkills saga that maybe you've never talked about publicly, or the press never asked, or the public really doesn't know. If the public knew some sort of heretofore unearthed tidbit that maybe you want to have sort of history record, or just maybe even if it's just a sentiment that you think is important, that again, folks who may see this video years from now, you want them to know about this entire saga. Susan?
But I think it goes back to what we were all talking about in terms of this entire saga, because it was, right? We called ourselves, we still kind of call ourselves from time to time the Forgotten Borough, because anything that wasn't wanted was going to come to Staten Island. And if Staten Island wanted something, we had to fight 10 times harder than any other borough to get it done. And it really was this lack of feeling that it was, 4 against 1. And then when you put the population in, it was overwhelming. And so I think so Freshkills was both awful and real, but it also was very symbolic of how the government in the rest of the city disregarded the lives and the health from time to time of the people of Staten Island, because for a very long time there was very little we could do about it. And so when you drive by there now and you see what's happening, I just hope the people who don't remember that see it not only as a beautiful park to be, but as a sign of respect that eventually the city and the state grew to have for the men and women of Staten Island.
Well, you can almost give a primer, a class on, if you want to teach political science, you can almost use this as an example. But not to repeat what Susan said, it was the arrogance.
Right.
It was just this elitist arrogance towards the people of Staten Island that don't waste your time. We're not doing anything. And the lies that they would throw our way, we asked questions that we thought were legitimate, and they would just lie, and they would just make stuff up, and as if these little pests are going to go away, and we have, what cards are they going to play? So let's just run out the clock. This is a bunch of people who just, are upset they're not getting their way, and it revealed a lot of hypocrisy. And for another conversation, but there were so-called environmental groups who, when you went to them and said, don't you support closing the landfill? They would say, well, we do it with conditions. I said, well, why don't we move the landfill to your house or to your neighborhood? Well, no, we can't do that, and because of whatever reason. So that was a great lesson. But the overarching lesson to me was, don't take no for an answer. If you're standing up, for the right reasons and representing the people we're blessed to represent on Staten Island, don't take no. Just keep doing it and doing it and doing. Don't stop until the job is done. And that's my sort of takeaway, other than the obvious.
I think the other thing that I think we should all take pride in as well is that the many little battles that were won before the war was won. That we were able to, while we realized that the landfill was an environmental and economic nightmare, we were able to chip back at it. We were able to cut back on some of its size, shrink its perimeter, which would ultimately shrink its height. We created the little scat boats that cleaned the waters, things that really didn't exist. The netting of barges to reduce and the netting rule applies to garbage barges anywhere in New York waterways, wherever the barge was going to go. The fact that the elimination of the ATHE carts, the development of red bag medical waste laws, all have roots in Freshkills, all little victories along the way. The consent orders with the Department of Environmental Conservation, trying to reduce vectors during the time the landfill was open. So we had the fact that the elected officials of Staten Island fought tooth and nail, not only to win the ultimate prize, to win the war, but to win little battles along the way and to make it incrementally better before we got to the real prize at the end of the war.
I would just say this, and I can't add to anything that Susan, Vito, or Eric just said, except just to kind of in a sort of a packaging sort of way it's just don't give up. We don't know what the battles of Staten Island will be 10 and 20 and 30 years from now. It's hard to imagine what they could be, but they will exist. And just that the people who are there, whether they're the elected officials or the community organizations, just not to give up. I mean, I think that's a lesson learned. It took 50 years, but we never gave up. And I hope the future of Staten Island, whether we're still around or we're not, is built with personalities that won't give up. And that'll just make a better future.
So each of you has kind of touched on what I want the last question to be, but let me try to frame it this way. There is folklore in this borough that the Verrazano toll hearing at Newton High School, when Guy was borough president, Guy was able to bring out 10,000 Staten Islanders that night. If you have that amount and say in reality Guy only got 5,000 out, in today's Staten Island, that's a miracle. That's better than extending the 5 fishes. When we talk about the number of people who turned out at the movie theaters near Freshkills in protest, people talk about 5,000 people turning out. If in the pre-COVID days on Staten Island of this last vintage, if you combine all the different meetings and gatherings and forums and protests, you can't get, you can have a few years worth cumulatively to get 5,000 Staten Islanders to turn out. I want to kind of combine that with the fact that everyone talks about, these planets lining up and help getting Giuliani and Pataki elected and then working all of it. And we know the political reality of that, of Staten Island playing a role in the mayor's race to that degree, or Staten Island playing a role to the degree that Guy did in Pataki, and is not likely. So I guess this is a long-winded way of to your counsel to Staten Island. Let's just dive a little deeper in that, because I think it's a message that this community needs to hear. It's a very different electorate. It's a very different society. Institutions that were revered have been dinged. So this is a chance for you to speak to our successors, years from now. Give them that sage counsel and to Staten Islanders about how they need to go about fighting important fights in the future. Because I think we all know the answer, but I think each of you can say it in a really personal, effective way. And they need to hear it because they need to get engaged above and beyond writing, vitriolic comments on social media. So Susan, we started with you. Let's end with you. Give Staten Island, future Staten Island electeds and future Staten Islanders a little bit of a pep talk about how we as a community win future battles.
Well, first of all, to the people of the community, just show up. Because I think that was the one thing that defined Staten Island during that time compared to other boroughs. When you talk about the Newdorp High School, it was amazing, right? The entire gymnasium was full. The line was out the door. We had the cafeteria full my job was like, we'd go to the front line of, the people who had come in last, and I'd say like, okay, you've been here a half an hour. Can you rotate out? And they would, everybody was there to be like, okay, I waited an hour to get in. Now I'm sitting here, but now I'm going to give up my seat to somebody else. People waited 3 hours and they were okay waiting in the cafeteria. They knew together, because they all showed up, that maybe they would be able to do something. And you know what? That scared the bejesus out of the people who are normally used to testifying before no one except the local press. It was incredible, incredible energy. It wasn't threatening. Nobody was, it wasn't a physical thing. It was very much a societal borough pride. Maybe not in looking at the garbage dump or the issues that we had with regard to infrastructure, but because of our neighbors. And I hope to God that was something that always differentiated Staten Island a little bit from the other boroughs, was that it still was that small town where we saw each other as neighbors, even if we didn't know each other. And that allowed us to trust each other a little bit more and show up for each other. And then when we showed up for the borough, we became a force that could not be reckoned with. Even though our population was so much less than the other boroughs, we were a population that had just so much more soul.
I think, Jimmy, the social media has so put a wet blanket on interpersonal relationships, flesh and blood, interpersonal relationships. The future issues that Staten Island elected officials will confront, the measure of success will be how they're going to be able to master social media to replace that physical contact. The things that used to unite us and create a network, a very active civic association network, people leaving their castle and actually going out to meetings and associating with people. Local newspapers that used to be a place, the Staten Island Advance being a place where the facts that were, you may not agree with their opinions, but at least everybody agreed that the reporting of an incident was accurate and gave a local perspective. So whether or not Staten Island elected officials of the future will be able to assemble the kind of popular force to deal with issues, I think is going to be a function of their ability to somehow harness, and I don't see it happening right now, I'll be honest with you, harness social media in a way to bring us together as the kind of teams, the kind of bipartisan teams that we came to know in the 80s and the 90s.
Vito?
We have to define who we are and what we want. What are our priorities? As Susan says, we think we're a little different, and that's a very positive thing where we sort of know our neighbors. Places in Manhattan where somebody living down the hall for 30 years, you don't even know who lives there. And we like to think we're a little different. So we define what our priorities are. We define who we are, be engaged, and show up, and understand that working together for the right reasons, anything is possible. And the flip side of that, and it's not, I'm not being critical of somebody, say from the city government or the state, we need to always be skeptical of when they come with a bouquet of flowers to say they're doing us a big favor. You know, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. I see no problem with ever questioning that thoroughly, because once something is established, as we saw going full circle with the Freshkills landfill, once something is established, it's very, very difficult to shut it down. So we should be extra cautious, extra vigilant to make sure whatever they're promising to do is in the best interest of the people of Staten Island.
Fred, you answered this already, but I want to give you
one thing that came to my mind, and I jotted it when you asked the question. Everyone has either mentioned it directly or alluded to it, and that's the impact of social media. And any future elected official is only going to get deeper and deeper into a communication that's completely detached from actually interacting in a personal way. So my advice would be simple. It would be, don't lead by tweet, and real leadership on a community level needs to be done with some level of face-to-face. And there are still opportunities to get out into the neighborhoods and to meet people, whether it's the ball field, or it's the movie theater, or it's the ferry terminal. You can't just think your success is based off your own messaging and whether or not people like you or not. And so that's really what my concern is that we're living in a time that people only care about how many followers they have. Whether they like them or not doesn't matter. Whether they support them or not doesn't matter. It's just how many followers they have. So I would just hope that anyone thinking about choosing a life in public service, particularly running for office, would recognize that leadership is more than just tweeting out your own point of view.
And to answer Jim's question, my takeaway, I'm so glad you're all having this conversation, because I didn't want it to be lost to history that Freshkills was closed by elected officials, with Guy Molinari coming up with the plan, by Guy using what he called people power. And that was a lot of work to fill that Newton High School with thousands of people on the toll. It took work. It just didn't happen. It was phone calls. The guy would call people continuously and then call other people. This was hard work, grassroots, people power. And I think that's one of the lessons of Freshkills, that if Guy didn't invest in Staten Island getting behind a mayor's candidate and a governor candidate, if he didn't get behind that and invest in these elected officials, we would not have had them in place. So, you know, what my always biggest memory with Freshkills is the morning Guy came into the office and said to us and the senior staff, we've just helped elect a mayor, we've just helped elect a governor. We have a window of opportunity to close the landfill. He saw that as a strategy. Find a hook. That hook happened to be the clean air. But that to me is the takeaway, when you can actually trace it to a moment in time like that. So people power still is there. Tapping into it, you know, is the question. And I just want to recall one other thing about Freshkills. Susan and I were with the regulatory agency on the landfill in its height, 24,000 tons of garbage a day. It was unbelievable. And saying to ourselves, this is just horrific. This can't be. And now, 20 years later, you've got people out there bird watching, kayaking, and kids chasing butterflies. I mean, I took a photo at Freshkills and I sent it to Susan saying, Guy would be so proud. He really, really would. And that's the story arc here. And what we're doing tonight, what you're doing tonight, is making sure that the students that are going to study this in school realize that the elected officials did all this work, all the nuances you talked about, all the steps you talked about, all of that is part of good government, and why there has to be people behind good government.
And you know what? We're so lucky that we have somebody like Ed Burke, who was there then and is here now and knows and can take such joy in following the trajectory from what it was and ensuring that it's going to be better than ever. So, you know, I think we all have to salute Ed Burke too for his vision for Staten Island.
Thank you, Eddie.
All right, everybody.
Thank
Well
you.
done. Stay
Hey, thank
safe.
you.
Stay well, everybody.